Welcome, everybody. I'm very happy today. I did an interview with Richard Poe a few months back on TNT when I still had that show. Sad, but the show was fantastic. It blew my mind, and it got a lot of really great feedback. So I had been formally paying attention to Richard's work for 8 or 9 months, and I was just blown away. There's something that was very unique that stood apart that I think many here who are listening and have already read one or two of the essays by Richard understands that he's onto something. The approach to the battle over ideas, the essential causal nexus of ideas per se in shaping material history, and the understanding or the appreciation of the a bit of both of the nature of oligarchy and the nature of how masses are herded, manipulated for a very long time. Far, I mean, very, very impressive stuff. So his work really impressed me. I was really, really overjoyed, and many of the audience members who listened to the interview were very, very overjoyed to receive that conversation. Richard has agreed today to elucidate us on certain uns unspeakable truths that you're not supposed to say out loud in polite society, and this is going to touch on our current realm, our current age, in a number of very important ways. Richard is also going to be publishing a book on May 7th. So this is going to be a nice little launch-in promo in some way to help raise awareness and attention that people should pick up that book, spread the knowledge that this is out there and available. And what we're going to do, like usual, is after the formal presentation is done, I'm sure a lot of people are going to have questions, thoughts they want to share. Put your names in the description box, and I'll call upon you in queue. If you want me to ask the question, like usual, write out your question, make it concise. I will do it. Otherwise, I think that's all that really needs to be heard. So, Richard, thank you so much. The stage is all yours.
Well, thank you. Should we start with the first slide?
If you'd like to, yeah, I can pull up a slide.
Sure. Okay, well, partly I just wanted that slide up there so you could see my new book. Just a moment of shameless self-promotion. But also this book is the very subject that I'm going to be discussing today. And we're calling this 250 Years of Color Revolution, this lecture, how the British invented social imperialism, called it communism, and blamed it on the Jews. Now, that's kind of a mouthful. So let me just start by saying what that means. I guess most of us know what a color revolution is, but we've probably learned of it through mass media, where we're shown crowds of happy, carefree young people festooned with colored ribbons and other sorts of happy symbols, flowers and the like, marching through the streets in far off countries, often or usually in Eastern Europe. And simply by the magical power, the magical Gandhi-esque power of their nonviolence and their good intentions, somehow mysteriously overwhelming governments which are deemed to be dictatorships or authoritarian states, and sending governments toppling, apparently through no effort at all, and simply through the force of their sheer goodness and innocence. And this is the picture that we've all gotten of what is a color revolution. And it's been very convincing to a lot of people. I see now a lot of healthy skepticism about this phenomenon on social media, but I don't know to what extent some people still believe in it. So I'm here to tell you that I guarantee you that happy young people with colored ribbons marching through the streets have absolutely zero capability of bringing down a government. In those cases where color revolutions are implemented, there's been a lot of groundwork that's been done beforehand, and that groundwork is the good old-fashioned kind of covert intelligence operations involving infiltration, penetration, subversion of the government, with particular attention to the police, the military, and the intelligence community of the target government, in such a way as to compromise that target government's ability to defend itself, so that by the time they unleash all the happy young people marching on the street, the job has already been done. And as I said, it's been done the good old-fashioned way, through old-fashioned intelligence work, often involving such unpleasant means as threats, bribery, even assassination. And so it's kind of an old regime change template that people have been using for centuries, governments have been using for centuries, but simply dressed up in a post-Gandhi, post-1960s flower power sort of presentation for some reason, because of the perception that that's what people want nowadays, or that's what people will believe nowadays, or who knows. But what I'm going to talk about today is the good old-fashioned aspect of regime change, because I believe two things, and my research has shown me two things, which is one, that this phenomenon of color revolution, as we have come to call it, was specifically invented and perfected by the British Empire, by the British secret services, and that they have been developing this capability of covertly toppling governments literally for centuries, and that indeed this ability is a kind of secret weapon for the British establishment, the British Empire. It is, I contend, in my book, it is the secret weapon that enabled the British to become the most powerful empire in the world, was the ability to make governments disappear when they became inconvenient. And I am contending that the two most iconic examples in our history, in our popular culture, of supposedly spontaneous uprisings of the people that supposedly overthrew tyranny, and I'm talking about the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, I contend that even those uprisings were actually color revolutions, perpetrated specifically by the British secret services as a weapon of war, in order to take out governments which were troublesome to the British for geopolitical reasons. So, and I will further say that I have found very strong evidence that a great deal of the a great many of the beliefs that have been fostered into our society, especially in the last 100 years or so, which essentially blame Jews for inventing communism, for being the primary source of communist revolutionaries, pushing communism in various countries, starting with Russia. This story, let's say that it's only half true, in the sense that yes, historically Jews have indeed been very disproportionately represented in revolutionary movements. We'll talk about some of the reasons why that may be. But as I said, that's only half the story. The other half of the story is that without the help of the British Empire, without the covert intervention of the British security state, the British secret services, the Bolsheviks, for example, never ever could have been anything except a discussion group meeting in coffee houses somewhere. And I contend that that is literally true. They had zero power to accomplish anything in the real world, any more than those color revolution marches that we see now on TV with all the colored ribbons and all that. They have no real power. And the Bolsheviks, despite all of the buildup that has been given to them by our propaganda organs, likewise had no power to accomplish the things that they supposedly did. No power to unseat the Tsar, no power to establish a government replacing the Tsar, and especially no power to foment the Bolshevik Revolution and then to fight a 5-year civil war in order to conquer the rest of the Russian Empire, a 5-year civil war fighting against the full power of the Russian military, commanded by the same generals who had served the Tsar in World War I, while these Bolsheviks were commanded by a guy named Leon Trotsky, who had zero military experience whatsoever, and somehow he supposedly beat them. And what I have shown in my book, and what I'm going to explain to you today, is that the Russian Civil War was, I call it the Vietnam before Vietnam, because it has many similarities to what we Americans experienced in Vietnam, where we were up against an enemy, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, who seemingly did not have the material resources to beat us on the battlefield, and yet somehow we were beaten anyway. And this is because we were beaten politically, and not by the Vietnamese, but by enemies within, in much the same way that color revolutions were. And the Russian Civil War, which lasted from about 1918 to, let's say, 1922, it really went on for a couple more years, but by 1921-22, it was pretty much over. Those white forces, which were supposedly fighting to overwhelm the Bolsheviks, were never actually allowed to do their job because they were directly under the supervision of the British War Department, and which was led then by Winston Churchill. He was the war secretary. So that brings me to the point I'd like to begin my story. The year is 1920. In fact, the exact date is February 8th, 1920. And the War Secretary of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, wrote an article. And could we see the next slide, please? Right, and this is the article. You can see it was called Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. Now, basically what Churchill said in this article, he said there are two kinds of Jews in the world. And he called them good Jews and bad Jews, quite literally. The good Jews, he said, are those who are helping the British establish a Jewish state in what was then called Palestine. This was a British project which was felt by the British establishment to be of great strategic importance for, among other things, controlling the Suez Canal and for providing a friendly, British-friendly nation in the Middle East for to act as a staging area for any actions that might have to be taken in the post-colonial world. And this was necessary from the British standpoint because the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. The British had defeated them after being allies with them for centuries, more than a century. And so they were reorganizing the Middle East, and planting a Jewish state there was deemed to be a matter of great strategic importance for British designs in the region, which was becoming very important because of its newly discovered oil fields and so forth. So Winston Churchill, in this article, February 8th, 1920, he said, there are good Jews and bad Jews. The good Jews are helping us to create this Jewish state, which will be an outpost of the British Empire in the Middle East. And the bad Jews, he said, are the ones in Russia who are stirring up trouble and fomenting a Bolshevism, who created a Bolshevik revolution, and who were at that time in 1920 fighting a civil war, the Reds, the communists against the whites, the anti-communists. And Churchill went farther, and he said that these bad Jews, as he called them, had not only fomented the Bolshevik Revolution, but they were actually responsible, he claimed, for literally every subversive movement in Europe for at least the last 150 years. He expressly mentioned the Bavarian Illuminati movement led by Adam Weishaupt, and which he claimed was a Jewish movement, a somewhat debatable statement. But he mentioned the French Revolution and all the revolutions in between, the revolutions of 1848, the Paris Commune. He didn't mention that specifically, but he literally said every subversive movement in Europe for the last 150 years has been led to some extent by these bad Jews, as he called them. And he's stated that this had become such a problem and that the outrage and shock of the world at the atrocities of the Bolsheviks was becoming so great and so serious that all Jews needed to consider their position and needed to that those Jews who were good Jews, again defined as Jews helping the British Empire establish the state of Israel, that these good Jews needed to go out of their way to denounce and to work against the bad Jews. Otherwise, they might be caught up in the backlash, which he more or less predicted was coming. So there was actually a threat behind Churchill's words. Now, I remind you, this article was written in February of 1920, and Hitler's famous book Mein Kampf was published in 1925. So this predated it by some years, but it gave forth a very similar message in the sense that it blamed the Bolshevik Revolution and it blamed the whole threat of communist subversion on the Jews. And it warned that if the Jews did not back down and stop pushing revolution, that something very bad was going to happen to them. And this, coming from the war secretary of the British Empire, was very potent propaganda, which of course led directly to the unhappy events of the 20th century, where anti-Jewish propaganda and anti-Jewish movements very much defined the 20th century up to a certain point, and very tragically so. So it's interesting to realize that one of the first expressions of this idea came from Winston Churchill, a man whom we normally associate with being a great opponent of Hitler and the Nazis, being the great champion of the free world against them. And he did take on that role later in life. But as we can see, in 1920, his views were not dissimilar to those of Adolf Hitler, certainly not on this subject, and certainly not his public views. His private views may have been quite different, I think they were, but Churchill was cynically making propaganda for a specific purpose, and he was speaking on behalf of the entire British government. The the Foreign Office, just a few months before, had issued a white paper reporting on Bolshevik atrocities in Russia and saying that Jews were the primary force behind the assassination of the Tsar and his family and behind the Bolshevik Revolution generally. And in addition to that, the British war propaganda apparatus had mobilized itself to publish and popularize and disseminate and to distribute a book called The Jewish Peril, which it was actually a translation, an English translation of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And it was published under the title, the Jewish Peril, subtitle, The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Now, this book, The Protocols, which is a document, let's say, of dubious origin. It purports to prove a Jewish plot to enslave the world, to covertly take control of all governments and to enslave the world. It came out in Russia in 1903, didn't make much of a splash. It didn't attract that much attention. But under the personal guidance of War Secretary Winston Churchill and the British Foreign Office and a number of people, a number of individuals, all of whom were tied one way or the other to British intelligence and the British war propaganda apparatus, all got together and they published an English translation of this book and disseminated it very widely. It was sent to every major newspaper in the UK, and in many cases praised and promoted. There was a big series about it in the London Morning Post.
Sorry, 1 second. Magdalena, go back one slide, please. Yeah, thank you.
Actually, let's go forward a slide because that's the very thing I'm talking about. These are some of the quotes from Winston Churchill that were in his article. So the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion had never before gotten such a promotional platform, and the publisher which published them in the very first British edition was a government press. It was called Spottison. Well, I forget the name of it, but it was a government press which was entrusted with publishing things like the King James Bible, the Anglican prayer book, works that were owned by the Crown under Crown copyright, a very high-end publisher, part of the British establishment. This was the publisher, I think it was called Eyre and Spottiswoode, and they were selected to publish The Jewish Peril. And the first press run, I believe, was 25,000. It was more than the press run of The Great Gatsby when that was published a couple of years later. So this was a major rollout of what was intended to be a major book by the British government itself. So you see, when Churchill wrote this article, he was acting in cooperation with the whole British establishment. This was an official propaganda campaign by the British government at the very highest levels, and the purpose of it was to say two things. One, that Jews were the primary culprits who had caused the Bolshevik Revolution, and two, as we see in the quotes on the screen right now, that not only had Jews caused the Bolshevik Revolution and Russian Civil War, which is still ongoing at the time, but they had also caused all of these other subversive movements going back to the 1770s. So what was the reason for doing this? Why did the British government suddenly turn on the Jews this way and launch such a ferocious anti-Jewish propaganda campaign? Well, my contention is they did it to create a cover story. They blamed the Jews for fomenting these revolutions, not just the current one in Russia, but all the others in the age of revolution going back 150 years. They wanted to shift blame to the Jews because it was actually the British themselves who had been the prime movers in causing those insurrections to happen. And I'm talking about the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, and so on and so forth. This, in my opinion, and according to my research, this message that the British propagandists were putting out in 1920, it was a cover story specifically designed to divert public attention from the British from the subversive activities of that the British themselves were doing. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Now, this is a woman named Claire Sheridan. She was a British spy. She was Churchill's first cousin. Of all his relatives, I have read, she was the one of whom he was most fond and with whom he was closest. She was a sculptress. She claimed to be a Bolshevik sympathizer, an ardent leftist, and she went to Russia. She sculpted Trotsky's portrait and reportedly became his lover. Now, the thing about Trotsky is that he is pretty well known to have been a British agent. And I'm going to give you some of the reasons why that's known. But what's important about that is that Trotsky was the man who was most personally and directly responsible for the Bolshevik coup the night of November 7th, 1917. That is going by the new calendar. Trotsky personally led and directed that coup the night of the Bolshevik Revolution. But then he was put in charge of all of the armed forces of the Bolsheviks. By land and sea, he was made the commander-in-chief. And he, whether through his own skill or for whatever other reason, as I mentioned before, he somehow miraculously defeated all of the Allied armies of intervention which were sent against him, and all of the white armies who were the cream of the Russian imperial forces, the cream of the Russian imperial officer corps, and virtually all of the loyalist Russian troops who still stood by the old regime. Somehow, all those men, I think there's an estimate there were maybe 300,000 white troops at one point, and another 200,000 foreign troops in the Allied expeditionary force, among whom were 60,000 British troops. You'll often hear the number 14,000 as the number of British troops, by the way, who were sent to Russia during that time, but they were actually 60,000. 14,000 is just the number who were in the Northern Army who came in through Archangel, but there were 40,000 who were immediately, after the revolution, immediately sent into the Caucasus to seize the oil fields there, because it was the British intention at that time to separate the Caucasus into a separate country, which would become a British protectorate. So the British troop strength in Russia is much, much bigger than 14,000. For some reason, that number is always given. It was 60,000 at its height. The Japanese had even more, and there were several other countries, including the United States. We sent a few thousand. But the British were really running the show. It was their show. They had caused the revolution. They had planned it. They had made it happen. And they were deeply involved on the ground in, let's say, supervising or manipulating the course of the Russian Civil War. Now, the thing about Trotsky is there's some very strong evidence that not only Trotsky, but essentially the whole upper leadership of the Bolshevik movement were being groomed and recruited by British intelligence as early as 1902. Lenin in 1902 gave a speech at a place called Toynbee Hall, which was an important location for the so-called settlement movement. This was, well, it was part of the so-called Round Table movement. Many of you might be familiar with this from the writings of Carroll Quigley. There was a movement at Oxford of people who were inspired by the ideas of John Ruskin and who were supposedly also led and inspired by a young Cecil Rhodes. I think both of those men were really just public faces for much more powerful forces behind the scenes, including the royal family itself. It was the whole British government and the whole British society that was behind this roundtable movement. And the purpose of this movement was to draw the English-speaking colonies, the English-speaking dominions, and all English-speaking countries into an ever closer union with England, and even to draw the United States back into the fold somehow. There were different opinions as to what status Cecil Rhodes himself wanted the United States to be a dominion in the same way that Canada is, which means that, well, at that time, and maybe even today, Canada's dominion status meant that it had self-rule locally, but that the British Foreign Office actually controlled its foreign affairs. And that was how dominion status worked. And so some people thought that the United States should have such a status as a dominion. Some thought that wasn't realistic. There should be more of a kind of partnership with the US partnering with the UK, the two countries merging together in some sense, which I think is what actually did happen. But anyway, not to go too far down the roundtable rabbit hole, but this was the group, this roundtable group, according to Georgetown University historian Carroll Quigley and many other reputable academic historians. This was the group that actually took control of Britain's foreign policy around the turn of the century and actually planned and caused World War I and World War II. So this was a very powerful group of people. And the Toynbee Hall was one of their projects. They were very much left of center, and they were always engaging in all kinds of socialistic and socially enlightened schemes. And Toynbee Hall was part of that. But Lenin was invited to speak there. He spoke there in 1902, and all the top Bolsheviks basically were brought there, including Trotsky. They met a lot of the top people in this roundtable movement, and some researchers, some authors believe that it was at that time that many of the top Bolshevik leaders were, in fact, recruited into agents of British intelligence, most likely Trotsky. Now, I tend to focus on Trotsky not so much because he's the only one who was under British intelligence control, but I try to stay as close as I can to things that are considered academically respectable. And in the case of Trotsky, his very suspicious connections with British intelligence are absolutely respectable subjects, which academics have written about and speculated about. There's no question that there was something going on between him and various British handlers, including this Claire Sheridan, who was Winston Churchill's cousin and at one point Trotsky's lover. So one of the curious things that happened was when the Tsar was overthrown in March of 1917, Trotsky was then in New York City working as a journalist, and he immediately set forth with some comrades to return to Russia and to take up the cause and to fight the revolution. He was arrested in Halifax. His ship stopped in Halifax to take on passengers, and the British arrested him. He was held in a British internment camp for a month, but then he was finally released by the British Secret Services. They weren't called MI6 in those days, the Foreign Intelligence Division. They were called something else. But it was basically the Foreign Intelligence Division of the British Secret Services. And their station chief for the United States was a guy named William Wiseman. And it was he personally who gave the order to free Trotsky and his comrades, to put them on a boat and let them continue to Russia. Now, this was an extraordinary thing because they knew who he was, they knew what he was going to do, and it is very, very difficult to explain what their motivations could have been. And in fact, no good motivation has ever been offered. But it is an undeniable fact that the British intervened, the British intelligence directly intervened, let him out of this internment camp and sent him to Russia, where he immediately went into the Petrograd Soviet, as it was called. It was the council of workers and soldiers, which had been formed. And he immediately called for an armed revolution to overthrow the new provisional government. And they voted yes. And so from that moment, the Bolshevik Revolution was inevitable. It had already been publicly declared, duly voted upon, and it was absolutely going to happen. So this was Trotsky, who was clearly a man who was being handled and given very special privileges by British intelligence. And I will mention further that in the Moscow treason trials of 1936 to 1938, which were all about Trotsky, and the whole purpose of them was to discredit and condemn Trotsky and all his followers and anybody who had any connection with his followers. That was the entire purpose of these enormous trials and purges that took place in the late 30s. And in those treason trials, Trotsky, of course, was out of the country. He had been banished in 1929. Excuse me. But in those trials, Trotsky was convicted of being a British agent, and the chief witness against him was a guy named Christian Rakovsky, one of the original Bolsheviks. And Rakovsky testified that when he was in London in 1924, he had been approached by British intelligence. They had presented him with some kind of forged letter that was incriminating to him and basically blackmailed him into agreeing that he would work for them. So according to Rakovsky's testimony at the treason trials in Moscow in 1938, Rakovsky said that he returned to Moscow and he confronted Trotsky, who was the foreign minister, among other things, and told him what happened. And Trotsky said, yes, I'm sorry about that forged letter. We had to do that. It was just a pretext. But yes, you will be working for British intelligence from now on. Now, this is what Rukowski testified, and on his testimony and much other testimony besides, Trotsky was formally convicted by the Soviet government of being a British spy. Now, of course, this is a Soviet show trial. It's not the most accurate source for information. We all know that. But still, there's plenty of independent evidence that corroborates what Rukowski said. And just to give another example, when the Russian Civil War broke out in 1918, the British had a fleet that was hovering around Murmansk in the north, and they weren't allowed to land, of course, because they were considered to be a hostile enemy force by the Bolsheviks, supposedly. But they wanted to land their expeditionary force there and begin operations, supposedly in support of the white forces against the Bolsheviks. And so the problem is the British fleet needed a pretext to land, and Trotsky provided it through a subordinate, a guy named Yuryev, who was the commander in the city of Murmansk. Trotsky sent him a telegram telling him the peace talks with the Germans have collapsed, which wasn't true, by the way, and the Germans might attack at any moment. So we need you to contact the British fleet and invite them to land and accept any help that you can from them. And Yuryev did as he was told. The British landed, and this was the beginning of the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. And Trotsky had personally invited this intervention. He had personally, in writing in a telegram, authorized this man Yuryev to bring the British expeditionary force in, to bring the British fleet in, along with the expeditionary force of many countries, eventually including US troops as well. And this was another issue that was brought up during his treason trials. It was one of the many pieces of evidence that the Stalin regime brought against him in these treason trials, but it was absolutely true. He did send such a telegram, and he did also lie in saying that the peace talks with the Germans had fallen through, when in fact they hadn't. On the contrary, Trotsky was in charge of those peace talks with the Germans, and he had completely capitulated to the Germans and handed over a huge chunk of Russian territory, including the Ukraine and Belarus, and basically all of the non-Russian republics in the West, basically rolling back the borders of the Russian Empire to what would be called Russia today. It was a huge victory for the Germans, a huge surrender by the Russians, by the Bolsheviks. So it wasn't true at all what he said, that the peace talks had fallen through, and he knew it. So this is another completely unexplained thing. And then in addition to inviting the British to bring in the foreign expeditionary force to supposedly fight the Bolsheviks, another thing that Trotsky did, and this is the real kicker, as foreign minister, he was in charge of foreign policy. Now, during the course of the war, the Allies, led by the British, had made a deal with the Tsar. In early 1915, the Russians were getting clobbered. The Tsar was talking to the Germans. The Germans were offering a separate peace. The Tsar was listening. They had suffered terrible casualties. They were retreating on every front, the Russians. And the Tsar was ready to listen to peace talk. So the British then intervened and said, look, they said to the Tsar, if you stay in the war and keep your promises to us and fight it out to the bitter end, we promise you Constantinople and the Dardanelles Straits. Now, this was a prize that the Russians had been seeking for centuries, and that the British just as hard had been preventing them from taking by backing the Ottoman Turks on a number of occasions. And this was a huge bone of contention, specifically between the British and the Russians. The British did not want the Russians coming into the Mediterranean Sea with their war fleet, their Black Sea fleet, because that was considered an area of British influence. The British Navy needed to have full control over the Eastern Mediterranean to guard the trade routes to the east, including the Suez Canal, the trade routes going to India, to China, to points east, and at that time, going to the oil fields, which had been newly discovered in Iran, which was then called Persia. Now, these oil fields had been discovered in the 1900s. Not sure exactly when. I think it was 1908 officially when they supposedly discovered them, probably much earlier. But so the issue was that the British were offering something to the Tsar that there was no way they could keep that promise. But they made this promise anyway. And then somehow the Bolshevik Revolution happened with a lot of help from the British. And Trotsky was appointed. So the Bolshevik coup occurred according to the new calendar, not the old Julian calendar the Russians used to have, but the new calendar, November 7th. And I believe it was on November 8th that Trotsky appointed himself foreign minister. And then it was on November 22nd, not too much later, that he started doing some extraordinary things. His first act was to declare that all secret agreements made with other countries by the former Russian governments would be dissolved. They would not be honored, and he even published them, including the secret agreement by the British giving Constantinople to Russia. He published them and he repudiated them, saying, "We Bolsheviks are pure of heart, and we don't want to have anything to do with these nasty, dirty, imperialist agreements, such as you see here. They were all published. And we don't want Constantinople. We don't want the Dardanelles. We don't want anything, because we have our proletarian ideals," he said. And so not only did he repudiate the treaty awarding Constantinople to the Russians, their greatest dream for centuries, but he also awarded the entire nation of Persia to the British. He basically abandoned it, because under a prior agreement with the British, northern Persia had been under the Russian zone of influence, and a portion of southern Persia had been under the British influence, and then there was a large neutral zone in between. And so the British had insisted, when the Russians called for help in 1915, they wanted Britain to attack Turkey to relieve some of the pressure on them, because the Turks were beating them up in the Caucasus. So the British said, yes, we'll attack the Turks. In fact, we'll do a direct attack on Constantinople. And this became the Gallipoli campaign. And basically what happened is the British, as I explained in some detail in my book, the British deliberately pulled their punches and deliberately lost the Gallipoli campaign and sacrificed many tens of thousands of men of their own British troops, as well as many Commonwealth troops. And also French troops died needlessly in what was apparently a completely phony attack that was never meant to succeed. And the reason this was done is the British wanted to pretend to the Russians that they were running to their rescue, when actually they weren't running to their rescue. They were leaving the Russians on their own and were already planning to overthrow the Tsar. So as a result of the agreement made prior to Gallipoli, what the British required as the price to launch this fake attack, of course, the Russians didn't know it was fake. They wanted the Russians to concede to them a much larger stretch of this oil-rich territory in Iran. So where the British before had had kind of a little corner of Iran, then they got more than half of it. And then Trotsky, in one fell swoop, said, we don't want any Iranian oil. After all, we're communists. We don't care about money. We don't care about oil. And we have our proletarian ideals. We're pulling out of Iran. And so the Russians unilaterally pulled out. The British occupied the entire country. And again, this was the oil strike in Iran was the first great Middle Eastern oil strike that there was. And I think it's still the third or fourth largest oil deposits in the world. And this was a huge, huge treasure, a huge prize in and of itself, more than worth the blood and treasure expended for the waging of the entirety of World War I, at least from the standpoint of cold-blooded geopolitical calculation, such as you would get at Whitehall in the British government. An enormous prize of incalculable value. And it was simply given to the British by Trotsky, who, as we have said, was clearly a British agent. But the interesting thing is that Lenin and all the others, nobody seemed to object either. And that raises the question of just how deep was this British penetration of the Bolshevik regime. But so when the British took it over, when they took over Persia, due to Trotsky's generosity, they awarded all drilling rights in the nation of Persia to a company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And this Anglo-Persian Oil Company had been nationalized by the British government just about a month before the war started. The British government had bought 51% of this company 3 years before its value suddenly increased by who knows how many times. And as a result of all this, as a result of this shrewd and prescient purchase of 51% of this company, the British, and thanks to the generosity of and idealism, proletarian idealism of Leon Trotsky, the British government found itself in direct control of the largest oil fields, the largest, most bountiful oil fields in the world at that time, and the largest oil fields that anybody ever could have conceived or dreamed of. And this alone, as I mentioned, would have made the entire exercise of World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War, from the standpoint of cold-blooded geopolitical calculation, this war prize alone would have justified it all. And this is what the British got. And they got it directly from the Bolsheviks, and they got it directly from their agent, Trotsky. So this is the kind of thing that I have been researching and that I've written about in my book. There's so much more to tell, but I see we're coming up on the hour, I think, Matt, and
There's
I think
no obligation to end. If you want to continue the composition, you can certainly do that. Or if you want to shift to dialogue, you can do that too. It's your call. People are
why don't we
we've
go to
had presentations
questions?
that have gone on far beyond an hour.
Well, why don't we go to questions? Let's see if anyone is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Sure. So Magdalena, you can stop the screen share. That being said, as Richard just pointed out, anybody who has a question, you can put your name in the chat box or raise your digital hand, and now would be a great time to throw something out. I think Peter has been itching to share a thought or a question. Peter.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Thank you very much, Richard. I find this really enlightening. It fills a lot of gaps in my learning, and I know I make a couple observations. Uh, where was Stalin in all of this? And second, the question that I had written down was, uh, do the creation of the Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist movements in Judaism have a role in this larger story that you're telling?
Well, your first question about Stalin, he was there in London during the early days. I think he was in that first trip in 1902 with Lenin. They all made multiple trips to London to meet with this let's call it a cabal of British operatives who were involved with the Round Table movement. And there are some researchers who say that the whole Bolshevik movement was recruited and was actually run by British intelligence from the beginning. I don't make that leap. I don't go that far. As I explained, I stick with Trotsky because he's solid. I mean, if Trotsky wasn't a British agent, nobody was. I mean, the guy was even convicted in court. Yes, a Soviet court, but a court. Now, your second question, um, I have not done a great deal of research into, let's call it the Jewish end of this question. And I certainly intend to. I'm extremely curious to know more about it. I don't know much about it though, and that's not what my book is about. What I have to say about that in my book is basically this. Um, some people, when they see the title, the book is called How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. So some people have accused me of trying to do a whitewash and hold the Jews blameless, and it's no such thing. What I really am doing is just it's a question of focus, and I say it right up front in the book that the book opens with this statement, this article by Churchill, and several quotes from him, and so I concede the point up front. I say to be clear, Churchill was not wrong when he said that Jews were disproportionately represented in the Bolshevik movement. They were, but that was only half the story. And then I go on to tell the other half. And so my goal here is to tell the other half of why the British had so much success recruiting Jews for this type of operation, why they apparently liked and preferred to recruit Jews for this type of operation, what was going on within the Jewish community that made this a symbiotic relationship for these British intelligence operatives. These are fascinating questions, but they're not ones that I have answers to just now.
Okay.
I will. I will just throw in another detail. I'm not sure if you'll consider this. Peter was your name?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you'll consider this to be an answer to your question, but it's just a little more information. One of the really fascinating things that I discovered in this research is, there's an old story, and it's an old British propaganda story that was immediately publicized, that the Germans were supposedly the ones who were helping the Bolsheviks covertly, paying them off. Of course, there's the famous story of the sealed train that the Germans, with which the Germans transported Lenin and about 30 other Bolshevik leaders from their exile in Zurich, and then overland and on some ferries, and then brought him eventually right to Finland Station in Petrograd, where Lenin gave his famous speech at Finland Station. And so this was a major item of British propaganda at the time, saying, look, the Germans are supporting the Bolsheviks. And the Germans admitted it. General Ludendorff famously, in his memoir, which he wrote almost instantly in 1919, he freely admitted that they had helped Lenin, that they had financed him, and that they did this as an act of war because they needed to weaken the Russian state, and they thought stirring up revolutionary movements was a good way to do it. So that's the part that you read in all the conventional histories, in all the pop culture history. And that's all very well known. And it's all very well known because whatever British propaganda puts out has a tendency to become very well known throughout the world. They're the masters of propaganda, and they are in many ways the masters of the media, directly or indirectly, and their ability to get their message out through media, through education, is really quite staggering. As Carroll Quigley wrote in his books so many decades ago, and it's still true today. So this story of the Germans helping Lenin, everybody knows that story, but here's the part they don't know. Why did the Germans do this? Because it's a very un-German kind of thing to do, and in fact, it backfired on them, because no sooner had they, quote unquote, succeeded in helping the Bolsheviks take power, when the Bolshevik movement suddenly turned on Germany, the German government fell, armed communist militias were in the streets, the Kaiser fled the country into exile, and all this while the Germans were trying to negotiate a peace treaty with the French. So this bright idea of theirs, supposedly of the Germans, to help the Bolsheviks, immediately backfired on them. And there were even Bolsheviks like Rosa Luxemburg who came from Russia into Germany to help bring about this communist revolution. And it was a very serious revolution and civil war. There were parts of Germany, Bavaria was one which actually declared themselves to be Soviet states. And the only thing that stopped it was the German army and paramilitaries composed of veterans coming back from the front. They called them the Stahlhelm, the steel helmets. And they went through the streets and with armed force, and they slaughtered these revolutionaries. And if they had not met that force with that kind of military force, Germany too, in short order, would have become a Bolshevik state. It almost was. So all that to say that this strategy of the Germans was not only very un-German, it wasn't the kind of thing that they normally did, but it also was catastrophically wrong-headed and immediately backfired on them, almost causing the utter destruction of their country. So why did they do it? Were they just stupid? Well, it turns out that a guy named Parvis, it was his nickname, let's call it his code name. Now, he was a Russian Jew. He was born Israel Lazarevich Gelfand, and he was born, I think, in Latvia, and then he grew up in some other part of the Russian Empire. But he was basically banished from Russia for revolutionary activity at the age of 20. He went to live in Germany, and he became a very big participant in the revolutionary movement in exile in Zurich and in Germany and other places. He was very well known to Trotsky, Lenin, to all the big Bolshevik leaders, and they considered him to be one of them. But it turns out, well, maybe he really was one of them in this sense. It turns out that Parvis was a British agent, or became one. He turned up in Turkey, I think around 1908, if I'm not mistaken. And suddenly he was rich. He had a lot of money. He was in the import-export business, and he had access to all the top people. And he was acting as a sales agent for the German arms manufacturer Krupp and for the British arms manufacturer Vickers. And he was in partnership with a guy named Zakharov. Now, that's a Russian name, but this guy was supposedly Greek. His name was Basil Zakharov. And he's a man of mystery. In fact, there are books written about him called the Mystery Man of Europe. He was really quite a mysterious person. But even to the extent of what was his nationality, he was supposedly Greek. Supposedly his parents were exiled to Russia. They fled Greece during the anti-Greek genocide of the 1820s, when the Turks were reacting to the Greek Revolution by massacring all the ethnic Greeks who were on Anatolian territory. So they went to Russia. That's how he ended up with a Russian name, Zakharov. Supposedly his real name was Basileos Zakarios. All kinds of stories like that. Some people say he was Jewish, very possible. Some people say, yes, he was really Greek. Who knows? But the one thing that's certain about this guy, Zakharov, is that not only was he a British agent, he was a very, very high level one. He was awarded a knighthood, 2 knighthoods, in 1918 for his service to the British Empire during the war. He was the man who was deemed to have been the guiding genius of the Vickers armaments company. He brought the Maxim machine gun into their inventory and the Nordenfeld submarine and a lot of their big top sellers. He was the guy who made Vickers a world-class arms manufacturer, competing with Krupp. He did it single-handedly, became very, very wealthy. But there is no question this guy was a top level British agent, and he was a business partner of Parvis. And Parvis, through him, became a Vickers agent. So he at that point, when Parvis was in Istanbul, I think you'll find that most reputable academic historians are at least open to the idea that he was a double agent. Of course, the dominant story, again, is the British propaganda story that he was a German agent. And he was. He was a German agent, but he was also a British agent. The mere fact that he was a sales agent for Vickers made him a British agent by definition. But the fact that he was a close associate and business partner of this guy Zakharov meant he was in very, very deep with British intelligence, because Zakharov was very deep. And so this guy, who in all probability, I take the position in my book that all things considered, he was a double agent working for the British and only pretending to work for the Germans. This guy Parvis, supposedly on his own volition, came up with this brilliant idea. He approached one of his best contacts on the German side, a guy named Freiherr von Wangenheim, who was the German ambassador to Istanbul. And he said, listen, I have a way to take Russia out of the war. We fund this movement. They're called Bolsheviks. Most of the leaders are holed up in Zurich. There's this guy, Lenin. Lenin's great. You got to fund Lenin, put Lenin in charge of the revolution. He had the whole thing written up in a 20-page plan that is literally the plan for the Bolshevik Revolution. Von Wangenheim was all excited because he knew this guy is a German agent. He thought of him as a loyal servant of the German Empire. He sent him to the German Foreign Office. A few days later, Parvis sold his idea to them, and on that basis, the German government bought it. They said, we're going to do this. We're going to run with it. They appointed Parvis to be in charge of the whole program of organizing all of the socialist communist movements of Europe to foment a communist revolution in Russia. But the whole idea was presented to them. It was dumped in their laps in writing in a 20-page detailed plan by this guy Parvis. And so how do you look at this? Well, you can look at the conventional history, which says he was a German agent. The Germans did it. And that's an idea that was put out by British propaganda from the get-go. Or you can look at it from another wing of British propaganda. He was a Jew. He was one of these subversive Jews that Winston Churchill was talking about and that the British Foreign Office was talking about in their 1919 white paper, and that all the British press, which were tightly controlled, by the way, and censored and basically governed by the War Propaganda Bureau at that time in England. It was not a free press. It was a fully mobilized military propaganda press, and they authorized this campaign to say the Jews were behind it. So they were saying these two things: the Germans are behind it, the Jews are behind it. And in addition, they had a conspiracy writer. They had a number of them, but their top and favorite conspiracy writer was a woman named Nesta Webster, and she was cranking out these books. Great books, by the way, very interesting. I don't agree with everything she says, but anybody who's interested in alternative revisionist history must read the books of Nesta Webster. She has one called The French Revolution, one called Secret Societies, one called The World Revolution. And in these books, she puts forth the whole idea of a Jewish Masonic conspiracy being behind all revolutions going back at least, revolutionary movements going back at least to the Weishaupt's Illuminati. Now, the interesting thing about Nesta is she was a British propaganda asset, no doubt about it. Her father was a founding partner of Barclays Bank, one of the most powerful men in the British Empire. Her brother was part of the handful of men who formed the steering committee that governed the War Propaganda Bureau, that was in total control of all British media and all Commonwealth media throughout World War I. That was her brother. And so that's why she was getting such respectful reception from major publishers and from Winston Churchill himself, the war secretary, who quoted her in that article that I was citing before. He said, if you want to read about all this stuff, read Mrs. Webster. He was talking about this Nesta Webster. So her theory, she put the two things together. The theory that the Germans helped the Bolsheviks, the theory that the Jews were behind it. Nesta Webster put them both together. She said it was both the Germans and the Jews. She said the Germans and the Jews are in cahoots, and they have been at least since the time of Frederick the Great, she said, going back to the 18th century. She directly accused the German Hohenzollern monarchy of being the driving force behind all of these subversive movements, and the Jews as being somehow their servants. She actually didn't portray them as being in the dominant role, although she most definitely portrayed them in an extremely nefarious role. And she was the primary source that Churchill drew on in his article, and he cited her. And she was, as I said, obviously an official propagandist at a very high level. So this whole situation with Parvis, really, he's kind of at the center of this whole controversy of what role did the Germans really play? What role did the Jews really play? What role did the British really play? It all comes to a head in this guy Parvis, who conveniently died of a heart attack in 1924 while all these things were going on. So he didn't live to tell his tale. But Parvis is a real key to this puzzle, and he exemplifies the problem. The problem is that so many forces and counterforces were working together, including in the case of helping the Bolsheviks, the British and the Germans actually both supporting the Bolsheviks, even though they were fighting World War I, killing millions of each other's people. slaughtering each other's people on a daily basis, but through the exquisite spycraft of the British intelligence services, which, in my opinion, are the best, the most competent, the most experienced, the most effective, the most ruthless of all intelligence services. And they've been running circles around the Germans for centuries. And that's why when I said that backing the Bolsheviks was a very un-German thing to do, what I meant is that usually they're not smart enough to do stuff like that. It's the British who are smart enough to play that kind of game. And think about the game of Parvis, where, yes, they had many Jews whom they were recruiting who had reasons to get behind this movement. In Russia, of course, there was an ethnic grievance between the Jews and the Slavs, the Russians, the Russian monarchy. And ethnic grievances, of course, are always useful for somebody who wants to destabilize a country. So there was that. But then you had the British and the Germans actually cooperating with each other with the full knowledge of the British, maybe not so much knowledge of the Germans. And who was really running the show? It was all so many players, so much complexity. Well, it's my contention that the intelligence service which is most competent, which has the most capable leadership, and which has the greatest overall competence, is going to be the one to control the situation. When you have double, triple agents running around, overlapping each other this way, somebody's going to be in control of that, and it's going to be the smartest. It's going to be the one who has the most experience, the most know-how, the most ability to control all that complexity. I contend that's the British. Many might disagree with me. There's a British guy right now, I forget his name, he's writing books about how the German intelligence services are the best in the world, and they're still running the world to this day, he claims. You know, there's all kinds of theories out there. But bottom line is, well, I'll tell you the bottom line. Please tell me if I'm saying all this in answer to your question. Tell me to stop if I have to stop.
Richard,
Did you want to
you're on
say
a
something?
roll.
If you want me to keep going, I will. So the thing is, here's where it all came down to. So after the war, one of these newspapers that was participating in the anti-Jewish crusade, the London Morning Post, they did a big debate on this very question of who was really backing the Bolsheviks, the Germans or the British. So they got this German guy, Kurt Erlen was his name, and he was a spokesman for General Erich Ludendorff. Now, Ludendorff was a very important guy. He had been, basically, a lot of people don't know this, but Germany in the last 2 years of World War I had basically become a military dictatorship. Under a two-man junta, which was General Ludendorff and Field Marshal Hindenburg. So they basically ruled the country together. And Ludendorff actually, in a way, became the founder of the Nazi movement, because when the Nazis did their so-called beer hall putsch in 1923, they were under the command of Ludendorff. Ludendorff was the guy uniquely among the German elites who was willing to get down and dirty on the streets and involved with putting down the communist uprising, as I described before, and then involved with the beer hall putsch. And so this guy Ludendorff, he was very outspoken. He was very angry. He was the guy too who put out the idea that Germany had not really lost the war on the battlefield, but they had been stabbed in the back. This was the famous stab in the back theory. And the people who he claimed stabbed him in the back, he said, were the Jews. And so this was his explanation of why Germany lost the war. And for obvious reasons, this narrative led directly to the foundation of the Nazi movement and all that came afterwards, but with a lot of help from the British government through the kind of propaganda that I've been citing. So wherever you come down, wherever anybody comes down on this issue and what it all means, one of the things that is most interesting to me is how the British propaganda dovetailed with the German propaganda on this question of anti-Jewish uh, accusations, accusing the Jews of fomenting the Russian Revolution, the German Revolution of 1918, and the stab in the back, and all these other subversive activities. There was a complete union of opinion and a complete a melding of the British and German propaganda positions on this Jewish issue. And in the early 20s, when the whole Nazi movement got started. And that's very significant and very different from what we've been told in history. Now, what I was just going to tell you, I interrupted myself. So in this newspaper, the London Morning Post, they did a debate. They got this guy, Kurt Erlin, who was a spokesman for General Ludendorff, and they got Nesta Webster, this conspiracy author whom I described, who was a propaganda asset for the British government, and they had a debate. Who was really behind the Russian Revolution? So Nesta came in with both fists, saying, you Germans, you did it. You transported Lenin into Russia and all his henchmen. You gave them all this money. You admitted it. General Ludendorff admitted it in his memoir. You're guilty. You did it. It's your fault. So this guy, Kurt Erlin, he comes back. He says, yes, we did it. But you did too. Look what you did with Trotsky. He actually brought that up. He said he was in an internment camp in Halifax, and then you let him out and sent him to Russia, gave him a safe passage to Russia. So why did you do that? And in that very German way, he said, we're being perfectly honest with you and saying, yes, we did it. Here's why. Now you be honest with us and you tell us why you let Trotsky go to Russia. And of course, in her very English way, she didn't answer the question. And so that's the essential historical problem right there. It was all completely on the table and crystallized in the early 20s. It was all there. The whole set of conflicting narratives that would lead inexorably to the Second World War and all that came beyond it, then the Cold War. It was all planned, and it was all foreordained, and it was all prepared propagandistically by professionals, by the best in the business. And it was all done purposefully. And it is my contention that by blaming the Jews, by which I mean, let's say, greatly exaggerating the Jewish role, let's use the term greatly exaggerating, that this was a deliberate strategy of deflection by the British secret services to take attention off of them. And as in the illustration I just gave you, where this Kurt Erlin, this German guy, challenged Nesta Webster in a formal written debate. Why did you let Trotsky out? Why did you let Trotsky go? Why did you send him to Russia? She didn't answer. See, the German was saying, we are Germans, we are honorable. We, and that's their thing. They have that Germanic sense of honor. It says, we admit we did it. This is why we did it. Now you show us the same courtesy. But the English have a different way. She wouldn't answer. Instead, the British put out this massive anti-Jewish campaign saying the Jews did it. And so in my view, it's really a very classic sort of cover story. It's the generation of a cover story to cover up an intelligence operation. But beyond that, this is where it gets really interesting. In Churchill's article, he not only said that the Jews had fomented the Russian Revolution, he said they had fomented all subversive movements going back to the 18th century. And I believe that too was a cover story put out for exactly the same purpose, to deflect attention from British intelligence operations, such as the French Revolution. We didn't even get into that, but there's a few chapters in my book that talk about how the British actually intervened in the French Revolution, possibly caused the whole thing in the first place, almost certainly, but certainly intervened in it to make it worse. A similar dynamic to what happened in the Russian Revolution, where first the Tsar was made to abdicate, then a sort of moderate democratic government of Kerensky came in, and then the British manipulations caused the extremists to get in, the Bolsheviks. Very similar trajectory with the French. And what is interesting about that is from the very beginning, while the French Revolution was still in progress, they started coming out with propaganda then. In 1797, two books came out, both of which were projects overseen by British intelligence agents. One was a book by a French Jesuit cleric, the Abbé Baruel, and he had taken refuge in England because Catholic clerics were being massacred in France. And he wrote a multi-volume work, but the first volume came out in 1797. Gosh, I forget what it was called, but it was one of the first greatest real conspiracy classics, where he basically said that the French Revolution was caused by German Illuminists coming out of the Bavarian Illuminati who had infiltrated certain continental-based Masonic lodges, in particular the Grand Orient Lodge and some others that he named. And through these lodges, they had caused the revolution, and that the purpose of it was to install a satanic government which would eventually rule the world under a satanic regime. And so this is a narrative which, of course, now we see all over social media, but it really came to be through this book by this guy, Abbé Baruel. And he got a lot of his information from a Scottish man named John Robison, who in turn got his information from a Scottish Benedictine monk named Alexander Horne, who was a known secret agent for the British. He acted as a secret agent and diplomat for the British, and he was the one who gave all this information to Robison and to this Abbé Baruel about these secret societies and how they were involved in the French Revolution. So once again, as with Nesta Webster and so many others, we see the source of this information being actual known British agents and British propagandists who are sculpting and shaping the narrative for their own purposes, whatever that might be. Interestingly, in those first two books, and there were two, the Abbé Baruel wrote a book, and then his collaborator, John Robison, wrote his own book in the same year, 1797, both saying basically the same thing. I think Robison's book was called Proofs of a Conspiracy Against Civilization or something like that. These books, interestingly, blamed the Germans more than 100 years before World War I. They specifically blamed the Germans and the German or the Prussians. Of course, there was no actual Germany then, but the Prussians, the Bavarian Illuminati, they made it very clear that this satanic evil force came from Germany, and it came through the Illuminati and the Freemasons, not through the British, not through the English Masonic lodges. which they said were perfectly all right and were never involved in anything nefarious whatsoever. An interesting detail, common to both narratives. So the other interesting thing about it is that the Jews were not accused. The Jews are hardly mentioned in either one of these books. So 100 years later, we had Winston Churchill saying the Jews were involved in the French Revolution, but in the first generation of this British intelligence narrative put out through Robeson and Barrawell, the Jews were not blamed. It was the Germans. There was one Jew, this guy Ephraim, who was named, and he was clearly acting as an emissary of the Prussian monarchy, the Hohenzollerns. And he's basically the only Jew mentioned in either book. So it's interesting that they left the Jews out of this narrative. They put in the Illuminati, they put in the Masons, they put in the satanic secret societies of the Germans, but they didn't put in the Jews for whatever reason. But then in 1806, this guy Barrawell got a letter from a man claiming his name was Jean-Baptiste Simonini, and he was supposedly an army officer and an intelligence officer of the Italian city of Florence. And he claimed that he said, you wrote a great book. He said it's a very good book about these forces of the Antichrist, he called them. But he said, but you failed to illuminate the role of the Jews, said Simonini in this 1806 letter. And he said, I happen to know that the Jews are behind all of this. And he said, because I was able to infiltrate a Jewish cabal in some part of Italy, which I forget what it was. And he said he somehow convinced these Jews that he was one of them. And then they spilled their guts and told him the whole plot, he claims. And so the plot that he then described in this letter was essentially that the Illuminati and the Freemasons were just fronts for Jewish power, and that the Jews were the ones who were really behind it. And he went into some more details, most of which is really the whole narrative that you'll find in the protocols of the Elders of Zion in a sort of proto form 100 years earlier. And this letter, now the thing is, Barrawell tried to contact this man and couldn't find him, could not find any evidence that such a person existed. For that and other reasons, I suspect that this Simonini was an imaginary person, and that the letter was probably also written by British intelligence in order to feed more information to Barrawell and get him to incorporate it into his books. There is a strange story that he supposedly did incorporate some of this Simonini material into a book and then supposedly burned this book before his death. And God knows why he would do that, or even if that story is true. But what you see continually from beginning to end of this narrative, which begins, in the 1770s with the Illuminati and all that, what you see continually is the hidden hand of British intelligence shaping and sculpting the narrative in such a way as to serve their purposes. And this is what I write about in my book.
Yeah, it's interesting how I gotta get your book. This is really exciting. There's a character named George Gordon, who ran the Gordon riots in like 1780 in Britain, which was like sort of this first, it was like before the French Revolution, but it had a bit of a Jacobin, let's rally the poor against the rich aristocrats, and ultimately it just became an excuse to do a massive government clampdown run by this guy who was a Hellfire Club member, and what's his name? John Wilkes, the grandfather of John Wilkes Booth, was a British member of Parliament who was assigned to do the counter gang operation and like crack down on the riots. Now, Gordon disappears. He's exiled. He turns up as a Kabbalist. He's like he becomes this Kabbalist rabbi and becomes an advisor to like Queen Anne in France and creates a
Hmm.
scandal in France in the 1780s. It's really strange. But like you said, no matter where you go, you always find British intelligence in these Hellfire Club occultists.
Hmm.
Uh, whether it's there or whether it's in like Aleister Crowley and the Webster Vierake, George Sylvester Vierake operations in World War I and doing all this stuff. Yeah, they're just everywhere. You can't avoid them. It's fascinating stuff. We got a lot of people who want to ask you questions, Richard. I know that you love context. I love context, and I just enjoy just listening to you give like sort of a second class here. How much time do you have?
Well, I mean, my voice is getting a little hoarse. If maybe if we could go till 4, I mean, sort of keep to the
So 20
original
minutes.
schedule. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Sorry for most people, but will you have is there an email address where people could write you questions if they haven't been able to get their question thrown at you today? Or a website or something?
Um, well, there's my contact email. I can't even remember what it is. Oh, I
You
got
have
to
a
get
website,
my,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. richardpoe.com. If you go to the contact
Yeah,
page,
okay.
you'll see the email.
All right, and that's what we'll do. And we'll put this all in the description box under this video, including a link to your past books, your Substack, all of these things, so people can contact you in a number of ways that way. So, Monty, I know your hand. I've been looking at it for a while. I want you to throw out your short question.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard. Much appreciated. It touches on a subject I've been interested for many years, and I've heard it addressed, and it relates very much to what you're talking about, these networks going back to the French Revolution. And what I'm citing in particular is a reference to synarchism, which my understanding, Army intelligence in World War II identified a hidden hand or the synarchist network behind both the Nazis and the communists. And it reminds me, I'll draw from that article in the spring summer issue of Fidelio magazine from the Schiller Institute in 2004, in which LaRouche says that synarchist threat presently, which still exists today, goes back to the French Revolution. It was a bankers backed cult, which it used as a direct threat for against the French Revolution in both supporting the anarchist networks and the Jacobins and also later on uh, the right wing group Napoleon. And I was wondering if you had any reference to this in your research or your writings, but because it seems to be there is a network behind this British establishment that controls both the right and the left, and I think this synarchist network, which goes back to the French Revolution and perhaps before that, but to the present day. I mean, even in Ibero-America, there are synarchist networks today who identified that, and it seems very much in line with this gang counter gang operation where they control both sides against the middle. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, regarding the synarchism, I've heard of that, of course, but I've never looked into it much, and I can't say I know much about it. As to the larger question of a hidden hand, somebody beyond, let's say, the British establishment, which I like to talk about a lot. Of course, there's something behind it, and what that is, I haven't gotten there yet. A lot of the reason why I like to focus on the British is just because to me, I see it as kind of a first step, because it's obvious, it's there. I mean, as Americans, we are a quote unquote former British colony, and so our contact with the old world is largely through the British and through the structures that they've set up and through their interactions with us. So it's kind of the first place to go. But of course, what is behind the British and what is behind all empires. There seems to be, you can almost put it on a map. You could do an animated map. There seems to be a force of civilization, a spirit that moves from one country to the other. And it never seems to be in two countries at the same time. Maybe it starts in Egypt, or maybe it starts in Babylon, and then it goes to Greece. I mean, I'm skipping over some things. And it goes to Rome, and then it goes to France, and then it goes to Spain and England. And it's a spirit. It's kind of like the way, like the Spear of Destiny legend, that supposedly whoever has the spear will become the greatest empire. And that's another variation of this idea that there is a spirit of empire that moves from one to the other, that for one to gain it, the spirit, another must lose it. So there's all kinds of stories and mysticism about that idea, but what is the truth behind it? What are the actual forces? What are the structures? What are the secret societies? What are the belief systems that cause an empire to happen, that cause a group of people, a small group of ruling elites in one particular country, to suddenly attain global power, the power to rule other countries, and in the case of the British, to rule the whole world. I think they are the first who ever achieved that, though many tried before them. And there's so much information. Of course, there's the whole story, which a number of writers have explored, of the Venetian infiltration of England, the black nobility, and of course the Larouchians have written quite a lot on that. It's all very fascinating. I haven't had the time, frankly, to look into it very deeply, but I find, for example, with this black nobility narrative, I find the same issue, and I think of it as a propaganda issue, that almost anything that you look at, you're going to find two stories. So one story about the black nobility says that they are the actual descendants of the Roman patricians, or some faction of the Roman patricians who went to what is now Venice, and they're still basically the Roman patrician families. Then there's other people who will get in your face on social media who say they're Jews. The black nobility are actually Jews. And virtually any story that you get into, any narrative having to do with revisionist or alternative views of history, if somebody's expressing those views or exploring those views, they will be immediately confronted with somebody saying they're actually Jews. They're crypto Jews, they're secret Jews. And so it's very similar to what happened to the Abbé Barruel back in 1806. He wrote this great best-selling book saying it's the Germans, it's the Illuminati. Then he gets this letter in 1806 from some mysterious guy, Simonini, saying, no, it's the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. The Freemasons are Jews, the Illuminati are Jews, everybody's a Jew. And so this is the propaganda problem that I'm interested in right now, is, okay, why do we continually have this problem? I mean, either everybody is a Jew or everybody's not a Jew. I mean, it surely has to be one or the other. And where are these conflicting narratives coming from? And how do you reconcile them? How do you get to the truth? Very difficult when you're dealing with the product of professionally crafted propaganda, because they're pros and they're good at what they do. And all of these stories have been shaped and sculpted, and contradictory stories have been put out simultaneously by the same people. And it's all done to confuse and confound and to get people fighting with each other. So all I can do right now is I'm just trying to clear up, as much of the confusion as I can. It's sort of like trying to clean out the Augean stables what can you do? One shovelful at a time. Um, I don't know how else to explain it.
No, that's good. Dave, I think you might be the last question.
Hey Richard, great stuff. I mean, there's so much there. So I'll just be quick. Could you just comment on the Ruskin angle? I mean, I know Matt's brought it up, and there's so much research, right? And we're all doing different projects, so sometimes it helps to just get a few spark notes or whatever you call them. So yeah, Ruskin being one of these supposedly artistic, like the artsy intellectual, but yet you said he sort of was pivotal in the formation of the round table. If you could just speak to that a bit.
Yeah, well, that comes directly from Carroll Quigley, and I'm not sure if anybody else really says that. In his books, The Anglo-American Establishment, and I think especially in Tragedy and Hope, he puts a focus on Ruskin, which is still a little mysterious to me. He references a speech that he made at Oxford. I think it was his maiden speech, his first speech when he was appointed, and it was supposedly so inspired a whole generation of Oxford students that it brought the roundtable movement into being. And I read that speech. It's online. I've read it several times. What can I say? It's an okay speech, but it doesn't even seem to really be about the roundtable subject. What it's mostly about, strangely, is vocational training. It's saying that we have to get away from the idea of liberal education. It's not realistic, and people have to be taught practical skills in school. That's like 80% of what he talks about in there. And I was reading this and I'm like, okay, this is interesting, but why did this inspire Cecil Rhodes and all these people to go conquer the world? I don't get it. I mean, yes, interspersed in there, he has some references to, he says England must rule or die, and he puts a few lines in about basically saying that it's kind of a precursor of the white man's burden. It's saying we must take on the burden of conquest. Otherwise, we will be conquered and ruled by others. And so that's in there, but it's strange. It's just because supposedly Cecil Rhodes had a copy of this speech made in longhand and carried it on his person for his entire life. And I frankly, I don't get it when you look at the material. So we only have really Carroll Quigley's word, in a sense, and his knowledge, which was supposedly inside knowledge. Quigley claimed to be, in some sense, an insider with this group, this secret society that supposedly Cecil Rhodes had created. And I've heard some people say that his secret source in there was Zimmern. Is it Alfred Zimmern? The guy who wrote The Third British Empire. He was one of the roundtable people, and supposedly, I've read here and there, he was the secret source that Quigley mentions. But the bottom line is, I don't know if anyone else says this except Quigley, and it's weird that he says it, and it might be true, or it might be a distraction or a diversion for some reason. Now, Ruskin was certainly a very intriguing and suspicious character. The story of his marriage, of course, has been made into several movies in the UK. His disastrous marriage to a young girl, which he was unable to consummate due to his own, let's call them eccentricities. He seems to have been, according to some biographers, an occultist, and does seem to have had some connection with pedophilia and pedophile rings in Victorian England. So all of that certainly dovetails with what we know about elite circles, especially in that country. And He also called himself a communist, interestingly. He described himself as a communist, the reddest of the red, in one letter to the working men of London. And he did that because he was criticizing the Paris Commune. He was basically saying that they were too extreme, they were too radical, too wild, but he's all for them as far as communism goes, that he's a communist too, which was a really interesting thing for him to say because he was also an ardent traditionalist on matters such as the monarchy and the preservation and the furtherance of the English race, of the northern races, as he called them, who made up the population of the British Empire. I'm sorry, of the United Kingdom, and so he was very much a racial mystic. He was very much an occultist who seems to have had some connection with theosophy and with many of the occult projects that the Cecil family was financing, again, according to Quigley. So a lot of that has to do with how much do we trust Quigley. And Quigley, he's like everybody else, I guess. He has his agenda. He has his own particular spin on things. And who knows where the truth ends and the Quigley spin begins. Nobody knows. But we have to take all these sources. He's definitely an important source, and he definitely points his finger directly at Ruskin. He says that Ruskin personally was the catalyst that got the round table moving. I just can't figure out why, in all honesty. I can't figure. It's a mystery.
Did you read that? I remember. I don't know which notebook I have this in. That a younger Marx in the 1850s was a writer for Ruskin's. Was it the People's Journal or something, or the when he was teaching at the Working Man's College in London?
That I did not know. Thank you.
Let me go to try to find that for you. I'll see if I can. I didn't dig into it deeper than just taking note of the interesting piece of trivia. But yeah, it matters, right? And I didn't know that he considered him, or he'd actually referred to himself as a communist. That's also very interesting. I remember reading in Anton Chaikin's book, Treason in America, as well. He had a close colleague named what's his name, William Morris, and they found like the Arts and Crafts Association together and a whole bunch of weird occult things that they were doing together for many, many years. And Morris was part of the salons that Engels frequented as well. So that's another connection point that could be of value. But again, yeah, like there's so many leads and threads to pull on it when you're digging that down this this treasure trove. I think we're rounding out the hour here. I just had one thing. History Man asks here about what about Albert Pike's letters to predict Zionism, fascism, and communism? I'll just say one thing. I don't know if you want to say a quick word on that, but in my research, that looks like a forgery. It only appeared in like the 1940s. There's no evidence of this letter existing before that. It's using terminology that didn't exist when Albert Pike supposedly wrote it in the 1870s or 80s. Like fascism and things. So it smells like forgery to me. I don't know if you want to say a word on that.
Yeah, that was exactly my impression. The language seemed modern. It seemed too modern for something that was supposedly written in the 19th century. That was my first impression of it.
Yeah.
And that's an important impression.
Yeah, and keeping in mind forgeries are everywhere. We're dealing with smoke and mirrors, and just like before we started this class, Richard and I were chatting about just even researching things like Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati. You find very quickly that the story, the evidence, the letters associated with the participants, Cato and all these things, all came out of this weird situation of a mailman who got hit by a bolt of lightning on a road in Europe somewhere, and that's how they just found all of these letters. And it's like when you read the letters, there's just a fakery in the language, like a cartoonishness in the kind of language where obviously certain people who um, have been psychologically profiled as an audience who will want to read this sort of thing, and it's this profile of that audience that these letters have been written to accommodate. And same thing for Nesta Webster or the Protocols of Zion authors. People have been profiled in the general population, and there's certain things that you can say that will trigger an emotional reflex and induce convictions uh in things that people don't know where the convictions came from, but they all of a sudden are convinced that the Jews are evil or China is evil or whatever, and the cause of all my problems. And the thing being left out, as you pointed out so eloquently, is the actual causal hand of these weird occult networks, usually tied to something that is using the British or Britain as its seat of current power at the moment. So that's very interesting, that happens. So we all have to be on guard for that. Richard, I for anybody who didn't get to ask a question, I'm so sorry. Do you have time for one last question, or should we just round it out?
Okay, sure.
All right, one last question. All right, Jerry, you can have it.
Oh, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Richard. I gotta say I do subscribe to your Substack, and I really enjoy reading all your articles. And
Thank you.
this work you've done on the British role in the Russian Revolution is really important, and I appreciate the amount of work you've done to uncover this. So my question is way out there, but before the 1917 Russian Revolution, in 1911, you had the overthrow of the emperor in China. And I was just wondering if in any of your research you've looked at the British manipulation and intervention in that overthrowing of the Qing dynasty.
Well, I certainly think that it was. I think all of these revolutions are connected, especially in such an important country as China. The amount of organization, the amount of planning, the resources, the expense, and the diplomatic preparation that's needed to effect a regime change in a country as big and wealthy and strong as China was even then. You know, this can't be done by amateurs. This is done by the pros. This is done by the same people who do all these big revolutions, whoever they are. So in that respect, I simply assume that as a matter of, let's say, a matter of principle, just because it's logical. I can't say that I have studied the Chinese situation in great depth, although I'd like to. I'm learning more and more about it. But I guess that's about all I'd be willing to say at this point. That China is right in there with all the other great powers and subject to the same forces. I just haven't made a study of it to be able to shed any light on the details.
All right, you definitely went through an enormous amount of work of research here, and I thank you so much for sharing that. I look forward to picking up your book as soon as it comes out. I think everybody who's listening live is feeling the same way, and everybody listening on YouTube, the link to your book will be, well, the link to your Substack is going to be in the description box, where I'm sure your book will be announced. So that will all be very easy to find, and I'll include a few of your essays as well that this lecture was based around, for those who want to like dig in a little bit more. And otherwise, there's a lot of lines of research, a lot of doors you've just presented to us that have to be lockpicked, and I think you've just inspired a lot of people to do some serious research, because we need people to put their minds to this and paint this painting that has so long been obscured. And again, the idea is always this is not about the past. Classes like this are about the future. It's about understanding how to navigate through the terrain that we're all being, we're all living in a minefield that we have to figure out how to move through in order to create the type of reality that is befitting for a human civilization and not one dominated by death cults. So this is high value stuff. Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you everybody for taking this Sunday with us. Take care.
Thank you.